up, guys? Thanks for tuning into episode 15. The last couple of weeks have been kinda crazy as I've gotten a few things in order. To catch you guys up, shortly after the year-end Vegas trip, I ended up taking a much-needed break over in Palm Springs, and luckily enough, I was able to spend a few hours at Morongo mixing it up with the locals there. We'll be reviewing some of the hands from that session later in this vlog. I've been asked a couple times how I got my start in poker, and when I tell people that it started as a $0 bankroll challenge, I mostly get responses in the form of questions surrounding both why and how. I think it's interesting enough of a story to share with the community. As many of you already know, I'm currently focused on being a mid-high stakes cash game player, but it definitely didn't start out that way. I got my start about 10 years ago, grinding free roll tournaments on PokerStars, right around the great mortgage crash of '08. I had a job on Wall Street, and one of the guys I met through work suggested picking up poker for fun. I was a complete newbie at the time, and the only poker I saw was the WSOP being played on ESPN late night. Needless to say, I distinctly remember this conversation as it led me to take the next 3 months or so to actually study tournament poker during my free time using one of Skalansky's books. I also started putting in a lot of hours grinding online free roll tournaments hosted by PokerStars held on a regular basis called Hubble Satellites. The deal was that if you finished in the top 99 of a field of 15,000 players, they'd provide you with a satellite ticket entry into a day 2 tournament with an actual cash prize. I recall grinding out about 6 of these tickets over the course of a month, which I remember as pretty intense. In the end, it turns out I didn't end up using any of these, as PokerStars had sent me an invitation to another free roll tournament with a $500 cash pool. I ended up finishing in the top 1% of a field of 12,000 players and cashed out for a staggering 73 cents. From there, I spent about a day playing 1 cent, 2 cent cash and parlaying that into roughly $3. After that, I took those $3 and spent the next 3 months multi-tabling $1 and $3 turbo tournaments. By the end, I had run up a bankroll of just under $900. Coincidentally, right around this time I had also just moved to the LA area and decided to check out the meetup home game scene, where I met quite a few terrific friends along the way. Within the first 2 years of playing mostly live tournaments, I was able to take that 900 and run it up to a little over 13,000 before transitioning to being a live cash game player. I've been making several trips a year over to Vegas, moving up in the ranks, starting with 1-2 at the Mirage before stepping it up to 2-5 at the Bellagio. Ever since, it's been a mix of 2-5, 5-10, 10-20 and up. It's been quite the journey so far, and I'm happy to spend a little bit of time sharing the story with all of you. With that out of the way, let's move on to some hands from our session at Morongo. We had placed our name on the 5-10 interest list, and while we waited, we get called for the 2-5 game and buy in for the maximum of 1,000. Before we have the opportunity to set up the camera, we immediately get dealt in with a premium hand, pocket aces under the gun. Not sure what to expect, I opened the 25. To my surprise, almost everyone at the table calls, including the big blind. A side note to the guys at the table, if we're playing a bomb pot, it's only fair to let me know next time. 7 ways we're off to see a paired board of 10-9-9, and surprisingly, action fully checks around. When the 4 of clubs rolls off on the turn, action checks to me and I continue here for $55, and both the middle position and big blind calls. The river brings a deuce of hearts, which is as big as a brick as it gets. The big blind checks, and I bet 115 here. When the middle position player folds, action is back on the big blind, who now shoves all in for 350 on top. This is a pretty gross spot in my opinion, but an easy one to get away from, as this is just a super underbluff spot in your average 2-5 game. When I fold, the opponent is nice enough to show King 9 off for the win. Just a few hands in, and we look down at pocket aces again in the cutoff. I'm giddy with excitement as this feels like the opportune time for some redemption. The under the gun player limps in for 5, and action folds to me in the cutoff. In this case, I'm rather aware of the limp re-raise frequency with this specific player as being extremely high, but with aces we're actually hoping for that. We raise this up to 25 just like in the first hand, and the sticky small blind comes along for the ride. Action gets back to the under the gun player, and not too surprisingly he raises this to 150. I'm playing roughly 850 total, so this is a pretty standard jam situation here. The small blind folds, and the action is back on the limpery raiser, and interesting enough, we don't get snapped off immediately. But after a short tank, the opponent makes the call. It's my first time here playing at Morongo, so I asked the dealer if we can run it twice, and for some reason, she tells me she has no idea what I'm talking about. The opponent, who seems to be a regular here, clarifies with me that they don't do that here, so we're here to see the 5 cards just once. The board runs out King 5-4, Jack 8, and the opponent announces that he has a set, and I tell him that the set is good here. He flips over pocket jacks, and we ship our chips over to our opponent. While I am a little disappointed I didn't win the 80-20 flip, I can appreciate how courteous the opponent was in this hand. Well played, sir. Hands like the previous one can set the tone for the overall session, but let's see what we could do to stop being used as a piñata. We reload for 1,000, and about an orbit later we pick up Ace-Queen offsuit from middle position. First act limps in, and I raise to 25, and the cutoff, big blind, and the undergun limper all call. It doesn't get any better than flopping the joint on a king-high board. The big blind leads out for 30, and the undergun player calls. It's debatable whether we want to raise this board with these opponents or not. At this point, I decide to call and let a card peel off. The cutoff surprisingly calls as well, so we're still 4 ways to the turn. The turn brings the 9 of clubs, which completes the open-ended straight draw. The big blind bets 30 again, and the UTG player once again calls. This time, I decide to raise to 130 to thin the field a little bit. And the cutoff now calls pretty quickly while the other 2 fold. The river is a 10, which now pairs the board, and being out of position, I elect to check it over to our opponent, who also checks behind. We scoop this pot, and though we won this one, we get a sense that we're probably not playing our A game. I thought I shared this next hand as it was pretty opponent dependent, and without me telling you this, I think most of you would think I just lost my mind here. Even looking back at the hand history has me second guessing what on earth happened. So we have Ace-10 offsuit in the cutoff, and when the action gets to me, I decide to raise to 25 after 2 limpers, as Ace-10 is definitely way ahead of most of the hands that these guys are limping in with. The small blind calls here, and the 2 limpers fold. The small blind has been mostly playing a loose passive style and has shown the propensity to overfold in spots. I guess this is just my way of saying that on some specific boards, I'm likely to blast off here. The flop comes 7-3 deuce rainbow. When the small blind checks, I bet 40, and she snap calls so fast as if it was on autopilot. The turn is a 4, which makes the board a lot more connected, and brings in a backdoor flush draw. The small blind checks it over to us, and we bet 110, only to get another quick call. At this point, we're thinking that she's trying to hold on with a 1-pair type of hand, something like a pocket pair or a 7. What we do know is when the river comes to queen of spades, an action is checked over to us again for the 3rd time. That queen is a pretty good card to run a 3-barrel bluff against this specific opponent. I end up tossing out 3 black chips for a sizing of 300. This time, the opponent tanks for about 15 seconds while looking somewhat distraught, and at this point, I'm not so sure that this is going to work anymore. The opponent eventually does fold, and thankfully we get this one through. One of the players at the table seemingly knows what's up when he says, "Good bet." In this next hand, we look down at pocket deuces first act and we limp in for 5. The player to my immediate left raises to 15, and the hijack, cutoff, and button all call before action gets back to me, and I complete for 10 more. We are 5 ways to a flop of ace 3-3, and surprisingly, action checks around. We're pretty excited when the turn brings the deuce. We lead for 20 to adjust for hand strengths on this board, and just as it looks like everyone's about to fold, the button decides to make the call. The river is a 5, which completes the gut shot trade on the board, and we continue betting here for 40. To our surprise, when action gets over to the button, he tanks for a bit before making it 150 to go. As mentioned in the earlier hand, these kind of spots are just underbluffed in a 2-5 game, and for another 110 we're not folding here either. Raising here would probably be an overplay, as worse is never calling, and so we toss in the call and get shown pocket 5s for a rivered house. This hand pretty much epitomizes how poorly we've been running in the session so far, but there's really nothing to be done except for to run out the variance. In this next hand, there's an initial open of 15 in early position and a mid-position caller, and we look down to find king-queen of hearts. Action gets to me, and I raise to 55 to isolate and thin the field. The early position player calls and it's heads up. The flop comes Queen Jack Deuce Rainbow, and the opponent plays out a flow and leads out for 45. I always feel like trying to guess why someone would lead out in this configuration never makes any sense to me at least. However, this specific opponent isn't very deep to begin with, and I'm okay with letting him drive the action. The turn pairs the bottom card, and again the opponent continues here for 100. At this point he has roughly 150 behind, and we decide to raise this to 250. The opponent calls and we're up against ace queen, which is pretty much a disaster. The river is inconsequential and we double up this opponent. So far this session has definitely not been going our way, but just with everything else there's a little bit of ebb and flow. In hand number 7, we don't have live footage, so we'll be covering this hand off of my notes, as this hand helps paint a picture of the type of play that you can expect to run into if you're ever in the area. For this hand, we're in the small blind, and action starts with the middle position player raising to 20, which solicits 2 calls from both the cutoff and button. We look down at pocket queens in the small blind, and raise this to 110. The mid position player calls fairly quickly, and the button comes along as well. We're 3 ways to the flop of Jack 8-7 Rainbow, and first to act I continue here for 115. The mid position player folds pretty quickly, and the button decides to go all in for 265. This is a pretty trivial call for us, and the board runs out with a 7 and a 3. The button shows 10-8 of diamonds for a pair and a gut shot draw, which both had missed. Our queens are good, and not too shortly after we decide to rack up and get out of here. Here are the results from today's session. We were in for 2,000 and out for 1578, for a loss of 422 over 6 hours. We're back in the LA area, and we'll be back on the grind at our local LA haunts. One of these days, I might even stealth sneak into one of the meetup games to say hi to a bunch of you without anyone knowing. I'm just kidding. I'm always open to meeting all of you, as that's why I've made this channel in the first place. Thanks again for joining me on another poker vlog. I enjoyed making it, and I hope it was as interesting to watch. If you made it this far, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel so you don't miss out on any future content. Take care of yourselves, stay safe, and see you next time.